Hi, everybody. Laurel Libby here with Laura Whitcomb, my guest today. She is the president of Gun Owners of Maine. She's a staunch gun rights advocate, and she is the principal officer of Keep Maine Safe, which is the ballot committee in opposition to Question 2. Laura, welcome, and thanks so much for being on today. Can you tell us about Question 2? What is this ballot initiative?
Sure. So Question 2 is a proposal that was put on the ballot for people to vote on and decide whether or not they want to institute what we call a red flag law. Some people call it an extreme risk protection order. And what that would do would be to allow people to go and directly petition a judge in order to have somebody's dangerous weapons removed if they felt that they were a danger to themselves or others.
So to break that down a little bit, let's say we're friends, right? You thought that I was a danger to myself. You could petition a judge to have my dangerous weapons, i.e. guns, taken away. Is that accurate?
If you're related to the person, you can go directly to the judge. If you're not related to the person, or if you're not a household member, then you would have to go through law enforcement. And the problem with that is that if I, in your example, felt that you were a harm to yourself or to others, then I would have to go and present information to the judge. And the judge would have to, in that moment, decide whether or not that information was credible, whether it was factual, whether it was enough information for them to institute an order to go and take away your dangerous weapons.
So that sounds very one-sided to me. You could go and present, after going to law enforcement, you could go and present to the judge, and the judge would decide based on your word only, not mine at all, if I presented a danger and if my dangerous weapons, i.e. guns, should be taken away. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and that's why we have a pretty significant issue with that particular aspect of the proposal, because there's really no due process. So if I think that somebody's a danger to themselves or others, and I go and give that information to the judge, that person has absolutely no opportunity before their firearms or other dangerous weapons are removed to give their side of the story. And so there's no due process there. And your firearms, your property, your personal property, whether you're a huge advocate for firearms rights or whether you own firearms at all, there is something to be said for having your property removed that belongs to you without your day in court. And so that is a pretty big issue for us.
It's a pretty big issue for me, and I think anyone that supports the Constitution, our constitutional rights. And so obviously I join you in opposition to Question 2. I'm absolutely, I already voted no on 2. Our early voting has started. Folks can vote right now. And so as we talk about Question 2, let's put it in the context of what is Maine's current law right now. I know that this ballot initiative was certainly in response to the shooting in Lewiston several years ago. And so let's frame it in the context of what current law is and start from there.
Okay. So in current Maine law, there are multiple avenues by which somebody can address this issue of somebody being a harm to themselves or others. So we all know that there are protection from abuse orders. So somebody can go out and get an order, some people call them a PFA, and that basically says that you're not supposed to be in contact with that person if you fear that they would harm you. We also have what some people call a yellow flag law. In our current statute, you would be able to go to law enforcement and say, I think this person is a harm to themselves or to other people, and then they would get a mental health evaluation, and in collaboration with law enforcement and the mental health evaluation, they would determine if you were indeed a danger to yourself. And unfortunately, with the way that Question 2 is worded, the way that you would go about removing somebody's firearms is that there would be no mental health evaluation whatsoever. And so that piece is missing, and that opportunity to demonstrate whether or not you truly are a harm is absent.
So current law, I was on the Judiciary Committee my first term back in 2021, and I remember the yellow flag law coming before us that term, because there was a piece that had to be, shall we say, adjusted regarding how folks would be evaluated. And so I know from that experience that this law has been used, right? It's been used many times. It has been used many times since the shooting in Lewiston. I think that was very educational on how it could have been used to perhaps prevent that tragedy. This question 2 seems like an extreme response, and frankly, using a tragedy to advance political ends, extreme political ends. Can you talk to me a little bit, or a lot, about the proposed legislation and what it actually would do?
So someone asked me once, how do red flag laws work? And my response was, they don't. Because if you are genuinely concerned that somebody is going to hurt themselves, then under this question 2 proposal, the law enforcement officers in our state, which are opposed, by the way, they have stated their opposition quite firmly. They go in and take your dangerous weapons. For most people, that's firearms. And then under statute, it can be other things as well, depending on what the police deem.
I mean, is that defined? Could this be, a sharp knife, depending on who, your kitchen butcher knife, or who knows what under this law? So we're not just talking about firearms.
Not necessarily. So firearms are always considered to be a dangerous weapon, but depending on the person and depending on the law enforcement officer, then they would be able to determine in that moment what they perceive to be a dangerous weapon, which in the United States, statistically, you're more likely to die at somebody's hands or feet, by being punched or kicked to death than you are by a firearm.
Well, golly, I guess we can't go confiscating limbs now, can we?
No, certainly not. So the issue is that if you genuinely believe that somebody is going to hurt themselves or that they're going to go out and commit some sort of atrocity, such as the Lewiston shooting, then why would you leave the person there in their crisis? And under the red flag law proposal, under question 2, which is why we are so heavily advocating for a no vote from people in Maine on this, is that you go in, you take their firearms away, and then you leave them there. You don't give them any help. They aren't hooked up with any mental health services. Nothing's preventing them from going out and purchasing a firearm illegally. Nothing's preventing them from, having firearms stored in a different location than the police are at and going and getting those firearms and then continuing to potentially perpetrate that harm. And so you literally go in, take away people's firearms or dangerous weapons, as the statute reads, and then you leave them there, and that's it.
But isn't that so typical of these policies that Augusta Democrats and extreme leftists across our state advance? In that it's put forward as this measure that's intended to help people. It's an emotional reaction, and it's a Band-Aid that kind of covers this gaping wound, but actually does more harm than good. Because in the scenario you're describing, you are causing further agitation, right? You're taking someone's possessions without due process, and they're in perhaps an emotionally vulnerable state, perhaps dealing with mental health issues, perhaps not, depending on the impulses of the person doing the reporting, right? There's nothing saying that they have to have good intentions in all of this. And so you're leaving this person in a worse position than when you found them, with no resources whatsoever to actually address the real issue, if there is one. And that's what's so frustrating to me in all of this, is that our current yellow flag law addresses that and says, look, you have to get a mental health evaluation right out of the gate. And then there's this ability to plug folks into resources, versus this drastic, let's just take someone's stuff, right? Let's just take someone's stuff and then not help them, which really is the bottom line with a red flag law. So anything else from the proposed legislation that folks need to know as far as the nuts and bolts of how it would work?
I think one of the most common misconceptions is that when they say that members of your family, can petition a judge in order to remove your dangerous weapons, but it can also be former members of your family. And so it can be, your ex-spouse, your ex-partner. It could also be the mother or father of your child. So if
that doesn't seem ripe for abuse at all.
Exactly. So if you have somebody, like, for example, that you had a child with 20 years ago, maybe you were never married, you were never engaged, maybe you never even lived together, that person under this proposal could be the individual who goes to court and, petitions a judge to take away your property.
And on their word alone.
On their word alone. And I think one of the other things that people are starting to realize, in this technologically advanced age that we have, is that evidence can be very easily manipulated. And if you're not there to refute that, and you don't have the opportunity to give your side of the story, then you could have an ex-partner, an ex-spouse, who for whatever reason, is going in and trying to take away. Essentially, it's not just even about firearms. It's your property and things that you legally and lawfully own. And so there is a huge potential for abuse in the way that the statute is written. And, the other thing that's interesting about the way that they worded this proposal is that they somehow believe that it will be easier for family members to go through a court process and directly petition a judge, which to me seems more difficult and,
For sure.
more... you can put a little
It's
flag
more
on that.
onerous. It's more of a burden.
Yes.
Right?
Well, and intimidating, I guess, would be the word that I would look, is that it's more intimidating, in my opinion, to go through a court process and directly petition a judge than it would to contact your local law enforcement. And so it's a very far-reaching proposal. And I have said many, many times that this is one of the biggest pieces of gun control legislation that the state of Maine has ever seen.
Yeah, so let's just think about the practical ramifications there. So going from what's current law to what this would be, if I had a concern about a family member, then the course of action according to the law would be, instead of calling law enforcement, to petition a judge. I wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, can you imagine family members trying to navigate that?
Especially on the weekend.
Especially on the weekend, especially when you're really, really, truly concerned, right? Put the abuse of the system aside. You're truly concerned about a family member. You think that they are a danger to themselves. And instead of simply calling law enforcement, according to the current law, you are going to have to try to figure out how to navigate the court system. Yeah. I mean, talk about intimidating. And, we have seen our yellow flag law used many, many times, myriad times since the Lewiston shooting. And I think that we really saw how current law wasn't well utilized, and law enforcement has done a tremendous job of then responding and learning and using that law. Now, we'll have a conversation another time about current law, but right now we're going to just stick to question 2 and encouraging folks to vote no on 2. Bottom line. That's the bottom line on this question. So this legislation has brought together a really interesting coalition, right? Yes. We have got law enforcement across the state of Maine who are in opposition, strong opposition to question 2. We have got, of course, staunch Second Amendment supporters who are absolutely firmly against question 2, voting no on question 2. We also have Governor Janet Mills, who is and has been in opposition to this and any other red flag legislation. Why?
I think that it is certainly a very interesting question, and very rarely do you see somebody like Janet Mills and Paul LePage, for example, agree on something. And it's so far-reaching and so devoid of due process and so ripe for abuse that when you have Republicans and Democrats and independents and people who vote all the time and people who never vote, who have a very visceral reaction to the prospect of instituting this law in our state. And, it's interesting as you traverse the state and talk to different people. A lot of people don't even know that this is on the ballot. And they have a very physical reaction to the thought of not being able to defend themselves in court. And so even people who aren't super politically active are like, oh, I don't want that, and
Sure.
it's a very, like I said, very visceral physical reaction that people have. And so when you speak about like the Maine police and people who are in opposition, the Maine State Police testified for 40 minutes about why they were opposed to this legislation. And they submitted 3 pages of written testimony about why they're opposed. And so essentially what they said is that this law would be more dangerous. It would be more cumbersome. And, for lack of a better term, and perhaps a term that people are very familiar is, they're going to have to put together SWAT teams to go and take people's firearms away, because when you have law enforcement show up at your door to remove your firearms, if people aren't expecting them, in rural Maine, especially when you're not expecting somebody to be at your home, be at your property, then oftentimes people will arm themselves because they're trying to prepare themselves for an altercation. And that was one of the biggest talking points from the Maine State Police, was that this is going to be very dangerous. We're going to need more resources and essentially SWAT teams to be able to put this law into practice. And they're not interested in doing that when we already have a law that they are still becoming familiar with and being educated on and utilizing more frequently.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about the danger you're talking about there, the danger to law enforcement as they respond in this situation where the individual has no idea what is going on, right? Coming into this completely blind, where law enforcement is going to have to go into that situation and try to diffuse. And you talk about the SWAT teams they're going to need. That's alarming and dangerous for law enforcement, for the individual in question. But I also think about the family member who may have initiated this, and the danger that's putting them in, being the one kind of directly reaching out to the judge versus giving law enforcement a call and having that go through the channels that we currently have. That's a really huge burden, and I think a dangerous place to be.
It is dangerous, and I think that when you have a proposal such as question 2, and one of the reasons why we oppose it is that in the actual proposal, it directs that every single law enforcement agency across the state, whether it's a sheriff's office, the state police, or your local police department, has to craft a policy that would basically direct them on how to surprise people in their homes. That's actually part of the proposal, is that they have to craft policies so that the person in question who's having this order served does not know that they're coming. And that's very alarming to me as well.
Oh, for multiple reasons. And of course, the infringement on, our Second Amendment right and the lack of due process is a huge red flag concern for me. So, of course, I want to throw in there a vote no on 2 for anybody that's just tuning in. Explain how that due process should work versus what this red flag legislation would do.
I think that when we have rights that we talk about, that we have codified in the United States Constitution, that we've had for hundreds of years, and free speech, the ability to own firearms, when you have those types of rights, the bar should be really high to take them away. You should be able to have a very high burden of proof in order to remove somebody's ability to speak freely and their ability to protect themselves and their family, and for some Mainers, provide for their families by way of hunting. And so when we have those rights that we enjoy as United States citizens and as Maine citizens, that bar should be high. And under question 2, the bar is very low. And so when you're talking about the amount of evidence that it would take to remove that right that we're guaranteed as citizens, that threshold is very, very low. Conversely, in order to get your firearms back, you have to show an overwhelming burden of proof that you should be able to get your property back. And so on one hand, to have it removed, it's a very low burden that the person has to show. But to get it back, it's a high burden of evidence that you have to have, and you would almost certainly need an attorney, which is very costly. And so not only have you had your property removed and everything that means, both for your personal property as well as your reputation. Things in Maine happen. If you have the police show up at your door and have all your firearms removed, chances are people in your neighborhood are going to know about it. And so now you have had your property removed. You have to hire a costly attorney to try to get them back. You're only allowed to appeal one time in a year. And when then when that year is up, the person who filed the red flag order against you is notified that year is about to expire, and then they will have the opportunity to re-up that extreme risk protection order and then you have to go through the whole thing all over again.
Yeah. So I when I think about that lack of due process and how easy it would be for someone to manufacture evidence, frankly, I think about just this kind of goofy scenario where at one time when my kids were younger, I had cause to remind the tooth fairy to come one night, and the kids didn't believe that I texted the tooth fairy. So I changed my husband's name to Tooth Fairy, and voila, I have a screenshot of my conversation with the tooth fairy. It would be so easy for someone to manufacture evidence with a nefarious purpose in mind. I can't imagine that this law would not be abused. Let's read. I want to read the question itself. I think Shannon Bellows has done an amazing job making this sound like the most incredible policy ever, and not being accurate in what it actually is. So I'm going to read question 2. Question 2 says, do you want to allow courts to temporarily prohibit a person from having dangerous weapons if law enforcement, family, or household members show that the person poses a significant danger of causing physical injury to themselves or others? Well, good golly, that doesn't say anything about taking a person's weapons away without due process. That sounds like a feel-good policy. We both know, I think, that Shannon Bellows has a repeat pattern these days of weaponizing ballot questions. And it's incredibly important that we get the message out there that folks should vote no on 2. Can you talk about that a little bit, the ballot question?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're trying really hard for people to understand is that we don't want the first time they see question 2 to be when they look at their ballot, because you're absolutely correct. It looks like puppies and kittens and rainbows, and who wouldn't want this?
Sure.
In fact, that's how they got it on the ballot. When they were gathering signatures to put question 2 on the ballot, they said, do you want to end gun violence in Maine? Well, doesn't that sound fabulous?
Golly,
of course
I love
we do.
that.
Right. And so of course people are going to sign and say, yes, I do want to do that. And one of the other things that they said as well was, if we pass this law, then the Lewiston shooting wouldn't have happened, which is patently false. But those are the ways that they get these things on the ballot, and they're counting on people to not be informed about what's on their ballots and to go and read this very, very misleading question that leaves out, this proposal is 12 pages long. And the Secretary of State has boiled it down to 2 very benign sounding sentences.
Which is so interesting to me as one of the folks who led question 1 and getting that on the ballot, where we have the opposite scenario, right? We have to outline every little item on this scenario. But we're not talking about 1, but let's just put that plug in here for a moment. Vote yes on 1, no on 2, for myriad reasons on both. But continue.
Yes, no, it's true. They did receive completely opposite treatments. Question 1, every single thing that was in the proposal got, lined out in a paragraph. And whereas question 2, everything that's bad about it mysteriously didn't make it to the ballot question. So I tell people, know before you go. Know before you vote how you're going to vote, so that you're not basically tricked into voting for something that you don't really want. And for the most part, across the state of Maine, which has borne out in multiple referendum questions as they relate to firearms specifically. We had the bear referendum with baiting, we had universal background checks, and now we have this referendum for red flag. And what happens is when people find out what it actually means, that is when the tide turns. And so that is a big piece of what we're trying to do, is just educate people on what it actually means for the state of Maine. And, taking people's stuff without due process is not an American value.
It's certainly not a Maine value.
It's certainly not a Maine value.
I don't know a single Mainer that would say, well, yeah, sure, come on in and take my stuff without, good cause and due process.
Yeah, exactly. So it's question 2 is the wording is misleading. I believe it was done intentionally with an outcome in mind. And I just strongly encourage people to do a little bit of research, and I always tell people, don't take my word for it. Unlike the proponents of question 2, we don't have to lie about what's on the ballot question. And so when I give people information, I say, go check it out. Fact check me. Go read the proposal. Every single thing that I'm telling you is true. And that is why we are encouraging people to vote no.
Absolutely. I feel like that's such an echo of what we've been telling folks on question 1. There are so many lies out there and so much misinformation that we're really counting on Mainers who care about these issues to talk to their friends and family, to educate them, and then get them out to the polls, right? We need to take ownership of this election, of every election, if we want to ensure that Maine is the Maine that we want, right? And so I advocate, of course, go ahead and early vote. The polls are open. You can vote now through October 30th at your town hall. You can request an absentee ballot online. You can go in person, and you can also request a ballot through the mail. There are so many ways to go ahead and vote now to make sure that you bank that vote. And if you have a sick kid or a work trip that comes up on election day, that you have already voted. But then, of course, if you or your loved ones don't get out there to early vote, so critical that folks get out on November 4th and take 10 of your closest friends and family with you and vote yes on 1, no on 2. We've talked about kind of the dangers of question 2. We've talked about how it infringes on the Second Amendment and the lack of due process. Do you have any other pieces to add there, or should we move on to, will it actually do what it says it will do? We've talked about that a little bit, but I think we should really dive into that.
I think that when you have something that occurred in Maine, such as the Lewiston shooting, which was a tragedy, and I believe could have been avoided if people had utilized the laws that were already not only on the books in Maine, but also in the state of New York. And then you have people who are funded from out-of-state money that are coming into Maine and using that tragedy and the death of Maine residents in order to further their agenda. And so they give people false information. They play on people's emotions. They're counting on people to not do their research and to not look into things and to stay home and not vote.
Well, it will be a low turnout election, right? Theoretically, this is an off-year election, and that's why it's so important that you folks do drag their friends and family to the polls, because every single vote is going to matter in this context in an election like this year.
Absolutely.
So, critical.
There's no big names on the ballot. There's no elections for representatives. There are some people across the state that are running for their town councils and their school boards and that type of thing. But it does promise to be a low turnout election. And so when you have people that are coming from out of state who are funded from out of state money, they're always going to be able to spend more than we do, but we're counting on people to talk to their friends and family. And like you said, encourage 10 of your friends to get out and vote. And we're in Maine in the middle of hunting season. And so if people choose to early vote, then they will be able to get their vote in and know that they've cast their ballot, and then they won't have to worry about that once hunting season comes up. Okay, that's critical,
right? Yeah. Because November 4th is the election, and when does hunting season start? Remind us.
Rifle season opens on November 3rd.
Okay, so we've got November 3rd, rifle season opens. November 4th is the election. Get in now and bank your vote so that you can be out there if you want to be on November 4th and guilt-free, right? You've done your civic duty and can go hunt with conscience-free.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's so important because, you might be going to register your car and you can vote right then and there, sign your ballot, know that it's, secure with that in-person early voting. And basically, instead of taking that time out to go either on November 4th or at another time, if you're driving by your city hall or your town office, swing in. There's sure to be less lines, less waiting than there will be on, your typical election day. And then, like you said, you'll know that you've done what you need to do in order to keep Maine safe, essentially, which is why we call our ballot question committee that, frankly. We don't need people from out of state coming in and telling us that we need to be more like New York and more like California. We want to be Maine and be independent and not have our property removed without due process. And so when we encourage people to vote no on 2, we are encouraging people to, really solidify our way of life and reject out-of-state money and this out-of-state agenda that lies to Maine residents in order to further their own political agenda. And I think really Maine residents have really grown tired of that, and they need to say enough and vote no on 2.
Couldn't agree more, Laura. So we've covered some pretty vast territory today, talking about what question 2 is, why folks should vote no on 2, the potential for abuse based on this law versus the current law that we have, the dangers to law enforcement, to friends and family, to the individual themselves, that is part of that reason why folks should vote no on 2. We've talked about the coalition of people who are opposed. You know, when you, like you said, when you have Paula Page and Janet Mills on the same page on a policy, you know, you should pay attention to that probably. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you'd like to cover in these last moments, advocating with Maine people why they should vote no on 2?
I think there's 3 reasons. The top 3 reasons that I would give people for voting no on 2 is that there's no due process. We've talked about that. When you are accused of something, we have decided as a country that we should be able to defend ourselves, and question 2 provides none of that. The second thing would be the dangers to law enforcement. Law enforcement has come out over and above absolutely opposed to question 2, as well as the fact that it doesn't do anything to help Mainers. It doesn't get them a mental health evaluation. It doesn't, get them counseling. It doesn't prevent them from going out and getting a different method of harm. All it does is take away their dangerous weapons. It does absolutely nothing to help anyone who's in crisis. And in fact, I would assert that it probably makes the situation worse. And so for all of those reasons and many other things that are, hidden in that 12 pages of legislation, we would encourage people to vote no on 2.
Well, thank you so much for being my guest today and giving such a powerful message as to why folks should vote no on 2, kind of the hidden dangers and the actual facts behind this benign sounding question. Thank you so much for being here today. Folks need to get out to the polls today, tomorrow, through October 30th. Vote yes on 1, no on 2. And if they don't early vote, make sure that you are at your polls on November 4th to vote yes on 1, no on 2. Thanks so much, Laura.